On the afternoon of May 27, 2026, the Multnomah County District Attorney stepped before cameras and announced a fifth count of second-degree murder against a man already sitting in a jail cell, already charged with killing 4 women, already the subject of a joint multi-county task force that had spent years quietly piecing together a pattern the public barely knew existed. The fifth victim's name was Ashley Reel, and the moment that name was added to the indictment, something became impossible to ignore. Ashley Reel had already tried to warn the system about Jesse Lee Calhoun. She had filed a domestic violence complaint against him in November of 2022. The system took the report, and then Jesse Lee Calhoun remained free. Welcome to the Murder Tape Chronicles. I am your narrator, and this is where the verified record speaks louder than any headline. If this is your first time here, you are in the right place. We do not do rumors. We do not do speculation. We follow the evidence, the court filings, the documented timeline, and the facts that most coverage never reaches. If that is the kind of true crime content you have been looking for, follow the channel right now, because we are just getting started, and cases like this one are exactly why this series exists. Now, let me take you inside the case. This is not speculation. This is the case of Jesse Lee Calhoun, and it is one of the most consequential criminal cases in Pacific Northwest history in decades. The question at the center of it is not simply who did this. The question is how a man with a documented violent history, repeated supervision violations, and a filed domestic violence complaint against him stayed out of a prison cell long enough to be charged with killing 5 women across 3 Oregon counties. I have spent time inside the documented public record of this case. What follows is what the verified evidence, the court filings, the DA announcements, and the investigative timeline actually show. Let me tell you exactly how we got here. Jesse Lee Calhoun was not an unknown figure to Oregon law enforcement. When the first disappearances began to surface, he was a convicted felon. According to public records and reporting confirmed by multiple Oregon news outlets including Oregon Live and KON6, Calhoun had been serving a 50-month sentence for burglary and car theft. That sentence was not completed. In 2021, during the catastrophic wildfire season that tore through Oregon, Governor Kate Brown authorized early release for certain incarcerated individuals who agreed to participate in firefighting efforts. Calhoun was among those released. That detail, confirmed across multiple independent news outlets including the Oregonian and Oregon Public Broadcasting, is not in dispute. A man convicted of felony crimes, with a documented history inside the corrections system, was released early from a 50-month sentence in 2021 because he helped fight wildfires. What happened after that release is where the record becomes deeply troubling. According to reporting confirmed by multiple Oregon-based outlets, Calhoun violated his post-prison supervision terms on multiple occasions following his release. Post-prison supervision in Oregon functions as a monitored transition period, with conditions a released individual must meet. Violations are documented, they are reviewed, they carry consequences up to and including return to incarceration. The record shows that Calhoun's violations were documented, and yet, according to the established public timeline, he was not returned to custody prior to the first disappearances that investigators would eventually link to him. I want you to hold that fact as I walk you through the victims, because this is not background. This is the foundation of the entire case. The question of why Jesse Lee Calhoun was free in the months leading up to these deaths is not a side note. It is the central systemic failure that runs through every indictment count. Before the task force, before the arrests, before the 5 counts of second-degree murder, there were women whose lives intersected with Jesse Lee Calhoun and who are no longer alive. Bridget Webster disappeared in 2022. Joanna Speaks disappeared in 2022. Charity Perry disappeared in 2022. Kristen Smith disappeared in 2022. According to court filings and DA announcements confirmed across multiple outlets, including KGW8, the Oregonian, and OPB. These women were ultimately linked to Calhoun through a years-long investigation. Their remains were recovered from areas spanning 3 Oregon counties: Multnomah, Clackamas, and Polk. That geographic spread across heavily wooded terrain outside of the Portland metro corridor is one of the most significant documented facts in understanding why this investigation took as long as it did. And then there is Ashley Real. Ashley Real's name became the fifth count in yesterday's indictment. But Ashley Real's name should have appeared in law enforcement records long before that. In November of 2022, according to reporting confirmed by multiple Oregon outlets, Ashley Real filed a domestic violence complaint against Jesse Lee Calhoun. That report was taken. It was documented. Under Oregon law, a documented domestic violence complaint against a person on post-prison supervision is precisely the kind of violation that supervision officers and the court system are designed to act upon. A person on supervision who commits domestic violence has, by definition, violated the conditions of their supervised release. The record shows the complaint was filed. The record also shows that Calhoun was not revoked and returned to prison at that point. Shortly after that November 2022 complaint, Ashley Real disappeared. I want to stay with that sequence for a moment, because it is the kind of documented chain of events that does not require embellishment or exaggeration. The facts themselves carry the full weight of what happened. A woman who had been victimized by a man on supervised release told the system had a mechanism to act. The system did not act in time, and that woman is now the fifth named victim in a murder indictment. That is not alleged. That is the documented sequence according to public records and reporting from multiple independent Oregon outlets. Now let me walk you inside the investigation itself, because what the task force had to do to build this case is one of the more remarkable pieces of investigative work in recent Oregon criminal history, and it is almost entirely absent from the brief national coverage this case has received. When the disappearances began to accumulate in 2022, they did not immediately look like a single case to any one jurisdiction. That is because they were not occurring in a single jurisdiction. Multnomah County had missing persons reports. Clackamas County had separate reports. Polk County was geographically distinct. In each case, local investigators were working within their own systems, their own databases, their own evidence chains. The bodies, when they were eventually recovered, were found in remote wooded areas, which meant that the physical evidence recovery process itself was difficult, time-consuming, and methodologically challenging. At some point, according to reporting by Oregon Live and KGW8 confirmed across multiple outlets, investigators from multiple agencies began quietly coordinating. A joint task force formed. This is a documented investigative step that represents a significant resource and jurisdictional commitment. It means detectives from different counties, likely working with Oregon State Police, began sharing case files, evidence comparisons, and geographic analysis to determine whether what they were looking at was not a series of separate tragedies, but a pattern. The pattern, when it emerged, pointed to Jesse Lee Calhoun. Here is where the case stands at this point in the documented record. A man released early from prison in 2021, had accumulated supervision violations, had a domestic violence complaint filed against him in November 2022, and was now being investigated across 3 counties by a joint task force that had quietly concluded the disappearances were connected. The women were gone. The evidence chain was being built, and the public knew almost nothing about any of it. The documented timeline of the indictments shows how the evidentiary case was built in stages. In 2024, according to DA announcements and court records confirmed across multiple Oregon outlets, Calhoun was indicted on 3 counts of murder. This represented the first formal public acknowledgement by prosecutors that they had sufficient evidence to charge him with multiple killings. An indictment at that stage requires a grand jury to review the evidence and determine that probable cause exists for each count. 3 counts cleared that threshold in 2024. In late 2025, a 4th count was added. The indictment was expanded. This is a significant investigative step because it means that either new evidence had been developed, new forensic analysis had been completed, or the evidentiary standard required for the additional count had been met through continued investigation. The 4th count was not filed simultaneously with the first 3. It came separately. That gap between the 2024 triple indictment and the late 2025 4th count represents real investigative work, happening quietly, outside of public view, while Calhoun was already in custody and the public had largely moved on. And then yesterday, May 27, 2026, the Multnomah County District Attorney announced a fifth count, Ashley Reel. The fifth count brings the total number of second-degree murder charges against Jesse Lee Calhoun to 5. It also closes a deeply painful loop in the documented record. Ashley Reel, who had filed that domestic violence complaint against Calhoun in November of 2022, is now named in a murder indictment against the same man she reported. I want to be precise about the legal language here because precision matters in a case like this. Jesse Lee Calhoun has been charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder. In Oregon, second-degree murder under ORS 163-115 applies when a homicide is committed intentionally, but without the specific aggravated circumstances required for first-degree murder, or when it results from conduct showing extreme indifference to human life. He has not been convicted. The charges represent the prosecution's documented allegation, supported by evidence sufficient for a grand jury to return an indictment. He is presumed innocent under law, until and unless a jury finds otherwise. What is not in dispute is the documented public record surrounding his release, his supervision violations, the domestic violence complaint filed against him, and the geographic scope of the investigation that produced 5 indictment counts across multiple Oregon counties. Let me now pull the full documented timeline together, so the scope of what happened is absolutely clear. In 2021, Calhoun is released early from a 50-month sentence through the governor's wildfire clemency program. Post-prison supervision begins. According to multiple Oregon outlets, supervision violations are documented. He is not returned to custody. In November 2022, Ashley Reel files a domestic violence complaint against him. He is not revoked. In 2022, the disappearances of multiple women along highway corridors outside Portland are reported across multiple counties. Investigators begin to coordinate. Bodies are recovered from remote wooded areas spanning Multnomah, Clackamas, and Polk counties. A joint task force is formed. In 2024, a grand jury returns 3 murder indictments against Calhoun. In late 2025, a 4th count is added. On May 27, 2026, a 5th count is filed for Ashley Reel. From early release to 5 murder charges. That is the full arc of the documented record. There is a specific point in this timeline where I keep returning, and I think it is the point this case will ultimately be judged on. It is not the moment of the arrest. It is not the moment of the first indictment. It is November 2022, when Ashley Reel walked into a reporting process and told the system that Jesse Lee Calhoun was dangerous. That report, under a functioning supervision revocation process, should have triggered an immediate review. The supervision violations already on record should have already triggered revocation. The combination of an existing violation history and a new domestic violence complaint should have resulted in a return to custody. None of that happened in time. Oregon's post-prison supervision system operates under the Oregon Department of Corrections and is administered through local supervisory authorities. It has formal revocation procedures. A documented domestic violence act by a supervised individual is a standard revocation trigger. The question of why that process did not remove Calhoun from the community before additional victims were harmed is one that Oregon policymakers, the Department of Corrections, and the governor's office are now being asked to answer publicly. That accountability conversation is ongoing and documented in Oregon media as of the date of the 5th indictment. The wildfire clemency program itself has faced scrutiny in the documented aftermath of this case. According to reporting confirmed by multiple Oregon outlets, advocates and legislators have called for review of the criteria used to authorize early release for individuals with violent or felony histories. The program was implemented under emergency conditions during a genuine natural disaster. But the documented outcome in this specific case has forced a public reckoning about whether the supervision infrastructure was adequate to manage the risk created by releasing individuals whose full sentences had not been served. These are not hypothetical policy debates. They are documented public proceedings directly connected to the evidence record in the Calhoun case. The Pacific Northwest outside of Portland is not flat, densely populated suburban terrain. The highway corridors that connect Multnomah, Clackamas, and Polk counties run through areas with substantial forested land, remote access points, and significant distance between populated areas. When a body is recovered in that terrain, the investigation is not simply a matter of processing a scene in a known location. It requires search operations, forensic recovery in conditions that are physically demanding, and careful evidence preservation in environments exposed to weather and the passage of time. The fact that investigators were able to recover remains and build an evidentiary case sufficient for 5 indictment counts across 3 counties in that terrain over a multi-year investigation represents a significant prosecutorial and law enforcement achievement. That achievement does not undo the systemic failures that preceded it, but it is part of the full documented picture of what this case required, what the task force ultimately assembled, according to public court records and DA statements confirmed across multiple outlets, was an evidence chain connecting Calhoun to 5 separate victims across a geographic range that had initially made the pattern nearly invisible to any single investigating agency. The fact that the 5th count was filed nearly 4 years after the earliest disappearances tells you something important about both the difficulty of the evidentiary standard and the persistence of the investigators who continued building the case after the initial arrest. Jesse Lee Calhoun is currently in custody. He has been charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder. The case is active. A trial date has not been publicly confirmed as of the date of this episode. The documented public record shows that the prosecution has continued to build and expand the indictment over multiple years, suggesting that the evidentiary case is ongoing rather than static. The families of Bridget Webster, Joanna Speaks, Charity Perry, Kristen Smith, and Ashley Reel have each waded through years of investigation, years of uncertainty, and years of a legal process that moves on its own timeline, regardless of what the families need. The 5th indictment, announced yesterday, does not end their wait. It continues it into a trial that has not yet been scheduled. In a legal system that will now be asked to render judgment on everything the documented record contains. Ashley Reel filed a domestic violence complaint against Jesse Lee Calhoun in November 2022. That complaint is in the public record. Calhoun was on post-prison supervision at the time. He had documented supervision violations on record. The revocation process existed. The legal mechanism to remove him from the community existed. The complaint was the direct evidence that mechanism was designed to act upon. At what specific point in that documented chain, from the early release decision to the supervision violations to the November 2022 complaint, was the last moment this outcome could still have been prevented? And if you can identify that moment, what does that tell you about what the system is actually built to protect? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and on a case like this, that conversation matters. You have been watching the Murder Tape Chronicles. If this investigation gave you something that a 30-second headline never could, then this channel was built for you. Every episode on this channel is a full case breakdown built on verified evidence, documented court records, and the kind of deep investigative storytelling that the news cycle does not have time for. If you want to be here when the next case drops, follow the channel right now. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss it, because the next case is already in the record, and it is just as buried, just as important, and just as real as this one. The Murder Tape Chronicles. We follow the evidence, always.